Welcome, traveler. Today we drift into the Terran mind was our ultimate weapon. You're standing on the cracked metal bones of Virex Station, orbiting a forgotten star in the Shixel expanse. The stars out here hum a little quieter, like they've learned to hold their breath. There's no gravity here anymore, no air, no light, but there is memory. And it starts humming the moment your boot touches the deck. You step forward, mag boots clanking in a rhythm that echoes down the hollow. Corridors like a lullaby from an extinct civilization. The walls are singed, buckled in places, pitted by what the aliens used to call plasma reasoning. But what happened here wasn't firepower. Not really. No one ever found Terran weapons on Virex. Just one human operative. One. Let's be honest, you'd probably get vaporized within 5 minutes on a battlefield like this. But you're lucky tonight. You're just here for the story, not the radiation. If you end up liking this quiet little corner of the galaxy, feel free to subscribe and leave a like, but only if it genuinely makes your evening better. And hey, tell me where and when you're listening from. I always love seeing the spread across the stars and time zones. Now, lower the lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and let's begin the drift into tonight's quiet orbit. You pass a warped bulkhead, your gloved fingers trailing across its smooth, scorched metal. That curve wasn't caused by an explosion, it was implosion. Gravitic distortion, centered on one small human brain that thought too loudly and too strangely for the alien psionics to handle. It started with a question. Not the kind shouted in war rooms, but the kind whispered in dormitories and forums, and cafe booths back on Earth. If thought can bend reality, what happens when humanity stops thinking like anyone else? The answer came during the siege of Virex, the first true clash of minds instead of missiles. The Gauze coalition had surrounded the station with 9 dreadnoughts, each one brimming with psychic suppressors and echo-harmonic fields. Designed to subdue, designed to silence. But they hadn't planned on what a Terran mind could do, not when it wanted to bend. You float through a ruptured data room. Desks overturned, neural link headsets dangling like forgotten leashes. There's a chair in the center, upright, untouched, almost reverent. Scorched into the floor is a spiral pattern, radiating outward. No one could explain it. Sensors couldn't scan it. But it only appeared after the Gauze retreated in panic, their fleet trailing behind them like frightened fish. The operative, never found. Just a single entry in the final station log. I thought too hard and they unraveled. You grin, just a little. That's so very human. The archives later dubbed this incident the First Mindfield event. Like a minefield, but cognitive, invisible to alien sensors, instantly lethal, and entirely based on lateral thought, paradox projection, and something the aliens never evolved. Sarcasm. Some galactic historians still argue whether the event was accidental, whether the operative meant to weaponize their mind, or simply stumbled into it while trying to crack an encrypted lunch menu. Personally, you suspect the latter. After all, no one gets as dangerous as a hungry Terran programmer stuck in a high-security lockdown. You reach a sealed observation window. The stars outside stretch like melted glass. A quiet hum tickles the edge of your skull, echoes, faint, from the residual thought fields still lingering after decades. They never really left, just settled down, like dust. Here's the twist that still haunts the Council archives. The Gauze had stronger tech, faster ships, cleaner genetics. But they couldn't handle us. Not because we were better, because we were weirder. You chuckle to yourself. There's a beauty in that, isn't there? The most ancient weapon in the galaxy wasn't a blade or a beam or a bomb. It was the question. A real, messy, unquantifiable Terran question. Like, if the universe is infinite, how come your ships are always late? What happens if you teach a paradox to dream? Or the one that burned Virex into legend? What if I don't want to win, just to unmake the game? They say the operative was singing when the collapse began. Something from old Earth. A nursery rhyme. One Gauze survivor claimed he heard the melody in his head for weeks, drove him to grow flowers in airless rooms and rename his children after Terran cheeses. True? Maybe. False. Possibly. But in stories like these, what matters isn't what's real. It's what's believable and what spreads, and this one spread like wildfire in a vacuum. Through fleets. Through academies. Through species that never even had a word for metaphor before encountering a human mind. You tap your helmet, activating the station recorder. The log begins its soft pinging, echoing into the chamber, like sonar in a whale's skull, and quietly you begin humming too. Not for nostalgia, but as a warning. Because this is where it began, and they still don't know how we did it. The treaty was inked in violet glass. You remember it clearly. How the ceremonial chamber of the Koran hegemony shimmered with breathable gold vapor. How every alien dignitary present seemed slightly out of phase with reality. Their translucent forms humming just off your visual register. You stood at the Terran delegation table, palms flat, posture neutral, mind alert. The Galactic Concordate Peace Accords, a so-called final end to interspecies conflict. A symbolic pact that humanity was, for the first time, invited to sign. The universe expected us to feel honored. We were the last ones to be allowed in. The implication? That we had finally become civilized enough to participate. You didn't laugh aloud. That would have been undiplomatic. But inside, every human present thought the same thing. You have no idea what you're letting in. The treaty wasn't a peace offer. It was a test. The Quran wanted to see if we'd comply, if the so-called Terran mind could be domesticated. They didn't know that by inviting us to the table, they had given us the perfect vantage point to study theirs. See, humanity didn't trust the treaty. We understood instinctively what the others didn't. Trust wasn't built with shared documents, it was tested through silence, through what you didn't say. So while they signed in good faith, we signed with contingency. You carried the contingency. Folded into the sub-psychic microprint of the treaty page was a semantic key, one that would later unlock a database hidden in plain sight, disguised as a glossary of Terran idioms. Phrases like, pulling a fast one, left-handed compliment, batcrap crazy, and emotional roller coaster became strategic code markers. Our slang wasn't just language, it was encryption. The aliens read the treaty as a peace accord, but the Terran mind saw something else. A mirror. And once we were close enough to study their reflection, we started to notice the cracks. It began with their decision trees. You were part of the analysis team tasked with comparing cognitive branching between Terrans and their closest diplomatic species, the Threxan. Their thought paths were symmetrical, rigid, even beautiful, like crystal fractals. Ours? Tangled, recursive, stubborn, and occasionally completely illogical. In other words, adaptable. You'd toss them a simple contradiction, say, a hypothetical involving a sentient egg that wished not to hatch, and their processors would freeze. One ambassador blinked for 11 minutes straight. Another asked to be rebooted. They called it logical dissonance fatigue. To humans, we call it college. Some xenopsychologists argue we evolved this way due to Earth's hostile information environment. 10,000 years of mythology, politics, and internet memes prepared us to juggle ambiguity, like it was a party trick. The aliens? They'd never had to. Their societies valued clarity, consensus, and cognitive symmetry. They didn't understand that humans thrive in contradiction. So when the Koran began secret surveillance operations to test our compliance, bugging, embassies intercepting thought stream packets, staging harmless diplomatic misunderstandings, they assumed we'd falter, react, lash out. But we didn't. We anticipated it, and more importantly, we used it. You sat in on that first interrogation. A Koran ethics observer confronted you with a planted accusation of duplicity, hoping to gauge your emotional response. Instead, you calmly asked, define duplicity in a four-dimensional moral context. The silence lasted 2 full minutes. When they answered, they used a translated word that, unbeknownst to them, also referred to a type of Terran sandwich. You replied by inventing a parable about betrayal and mustard. Their log shows successfully confused possible minor stroke. We knew then, the war wouldn't be fought with weapons, it would be fought with assumptions. You think about the Terran children being trained back home, not in battle drills, but in paradox puzzles, in quantum metaphor games, in learning to say three contradictory things and mean all of them. Our brains weren't just flexible, they were slippery. One analyst on your team coined the term semantic judo. It described how humans could redirect hostile ideas by changing the context rather than the content. A hostile statement aimed at offense could be reframed as a compliment reframed as threat. It made translation software break. It made alien courts weep, and we never even raised our voices. Some historians later claimed the treaty worked, that it kept interstellar peace for 5 whole years. But you know better. You saw the sublayer communications. You saw the maps of silent incursions. You read the thoughts they didn't think we could decode. It was never peace. It was just the world's longest poker game. And humans? We bluff with entire realities. The aliens were never quite sure when we'd betray them. What? They didn't realize now was that we already had, because the Terran mind wasn't waiting for war. It was redefining it. They called it the synaptic crown. To the Quran, it was their most prestigious institution, a sprawling, floating campus orbiting a sunless moon, entirely dedicated to advanced cognition. You remember the first time you were granted entry? Your breath caught, not from awe but from the sheer arrogance built into its architecture. Everything gleamed, curved, and hummed like an overfunded meditation app. Silence wasn't just enforced. It was sacred. You weren't there as a guest. You were there as an auditor. Technically, Earth had been invited to observe cross-species academic methodology. In truth, the Crown wanted to measure Terran intellectual potential firsthand. What they didn't realize was that the measurement would go both ways. The first lecture you attended was titled Harmonic Logic Cascades, Stability in Truth Convergence. Delivered by a translucent seraphid neuralist named Ka Ilto, the talk attempted to map morality as a fixed coordinate system, using color metaphors and tensor charts. You sat politely, took notes, nodded at all the right intervals, then asked a question that detonated the room. What color is betrayal if both parties agree on the outcome? Ka Ilto blinked. Others blinked. The chart didn't have an axis for that. That's when you realized their intellect wasn't flawed, it was trapped. These creatures had evolved in ecosystems that favored clarity, not creativity. They worshipped stability of thought the way we worship adaptability. So you started poking, at first, subtly. You asked open-ended questions, created fake paradoxes, and watched their neural resonance fluctuate. Your favorite was one you lifted from a Terran comedian. If nothing is impossible, is it possible for something to be impossible? That one made a Threxan vomit code. Soon you had enough data to simulate their stress curves. Their neural patterns responded predictably to known dilemmas, but spiraled chaotically under improvised ambiguity. The same ambiguity humans consider basic social interaction. It was like playing chess against someone who thinks diagonals are imaginary. One night, while pretending to sleep in your chamber, you received a coded transmission from Earth. Embedded within it were schematics for a field test, something codenamed Project Greyline. The objective was simple: plant 3 contradictory axioms within the lecture halls and measure cascade failure. You chose your statements carefully. Truth is what survives interpretation. Lies that become culture are no longer false. If 2 minds disagree permanently, which one is sane? You whispered them into student forums, dropped them as jokes during meals, even scrawled one on the underside of a shared meditation mat. By the end of the week, debates had splintered the synaptic crown into factions. One group believed logic needed reinterpretive elasticity. Another argued for neural lattice hardening. A third faction dissolved entirely, claiming that epistemology was a colonizing force. You watched as the lectures grew more fragmented. Professors refused to cite each other. Some demanded their own isolated truth chambers. One faction began holding classes in absolute darkness, claiming it was the only way to avoid influence from biased photonic patterns. Earth hadn't sent weapons. It had sent you, and your weapon. One quietly humming, maddeningly human brain. You had expected pushback, a confrontation, an attempt to dissect or reprogram you. Instead, the faculty praised your disruptive insight. The dean offered you an honorary degree in pre-paradigmatic ethics, which you accepted with the faintest smirk. They didn't realize the irony. By their own definitions, your influence had corrupted the institution's cognitive integrity. But that wasn't the real damage. No, the true consequence came weeks later, when reports from other academies started echoing similar splinters. The ideas you seeded had metastasized. Students across the galaxy were now arguing about constructive contradiction and self-aware falsehoods. They called it a memequake. Some blamed Earth. Others refused to believe Terrans could cause such upheaval with mere words. But you knew the truth. We weren't better thinkers. We were louder ones, messier, loopier, trained in thousands of years of contradictory religions, quantum mechanics, sitcoms, and fan theories. We were raised not to resolve paradox, but to surf it, and the galaxy had no mental surfboards. Some, alien scholars years later, would refer to this period as the cognitive spill. One even tried to argue it was Earth's version of cultural warfare. But the debate never reached consensus, because even that required agreement on what consensus meant. You finished the memory by stepping through a reconstructed hologram of that very lecture hall. Dust motes swirl, projected in 4K fidelity. You look up to where Kailto once hovered above the podium. You whisper again the question that broke their symmetry. What color is betrayal if both parties agree on the outcome? Still no answer. They called it Operation Dreamquake. You called it nap time with consequences. It was the first sanctioned use of Terran lucid dream architecture as a planetary-level weapon, not through bombs, or code or viral upload, but through something far more insidious. Sleep. You were assigned to the embedded dream core aboard the SS Hypnos, a converted mining barge retrofitted with neurothought projectors and a caffeine recycling unit that never quite worked. Mission briefings were conducted, in semi-conscious states. Military command insisted it optimize dream fluidity. The target was planet Ixith Fifth, a deeply spiritual, highly telepathic society governed by something they called the collective whisper. A culture built on clarity of purpose and purity of mental space. What they didn't know was how fragile clarity becomes when you drop a human subconscious into it. You were the vector. On the third night the dreamwave was initiated. You slipped into a lucid state with the practiced ease of a Terran dreamwalker, trained from childhood on lucid immersion, chaos acceptance, and meme navigation. Your dreamscape began as something simple, an infinite library with no exits. Books. Titled, "This Statement is False," a handbook for those who refuse instructions, and how to decode this page without knowing the language. The Ixith mind link began feeding in, trying to interface to bring order. Bad idea, because human dreams don't just tell stories, they fracture reality. By the fourth minute, the Ixith dream participants were already overwhelmed. Their minds, unused to narrative contradiction, began interpreting your subconscious metaphors as universal truths. An Ixith elder fled a hallway of mirrors, each reflecting a version of himself with slightly different regrets. Another refused to move, trapped in a room where doors appeared only when he stopped looking for them. And then came the paradox seed. The more you search for meaning, the faster it escapes. You said it once in the dream. Just once. Within hours, their collective whisper began to stutter. You monitored the stream from your side. What started as harmonious pulses of intent devolved into fragmented, discordant waves. You'd introduced a narrative infection. It was beautiful. Command wanted proof of impact. So you gave them a recording. A dream transcript of the Ixith High Seer waking up, clutching his chest, whispering, "I have seen the edge of thought and it has teeth." That soundbite got passed around Earth's military like a bedtime story, but you weren't done. You added recursive elements, loops, symbols that meant different things depending on the context. depending on the viewer's guilt. An empty chair. A melting candle. A child's voice counting backward from 9 in a language the Ixith didn't speak, but still understood. Within days, Ixith 5 declared a planetary emergency. Not a military one, a spiritual one. They called it the Shattering. Entire temples closed for resynchronization. Oracles went mute. Dream shamans stopped accepting offerings, fearful of what they might see. And you? You were asked to do it, again. The Ethics Council raised objections. Some argued this was psychological colonization. Others said it was self-defense. One diplomat compared it to throwing glitter into a church's air vents. You just smiled and said, "Glitter's non-lethal, usually." Some galactic historians still debate whether Operation Dreamquake crossed a line, whether we had become the very thing we feared, manipulators of belief. But you know the truth, we didn't invent belief. We just weaponized how unstable it already was. And here's the thing they never grasped. Aliens evolved with consensus. Their societies were unified by shared mental frameworks. Our species, meanwhile, evolved amid contradiction. Faith and science, myth and logic, humor and horror. We grew up dreaming in static. You remember one final detail. As the SS Hypnos disengaged and slipped from orbit, your dream form, the one embedded in the planetary noosphere, left behind a final image, just a simple room. In it, a creature sat in a chair, back turned, unmoving, and on the wall above it, 3 words etched in looping infinite script. You asked first. Ixith never recovered. Their collective resonance decayed over months. They still exist, but quieter now, more fragmented, whispering in private, afraid of dreams. Back on Earth, we cataloged it as a Tier 2 neurosoft disruption success. But in your notes, you wrote something else. Sometimes the loudest weapon and is the one you sleep through. You always liked that coffee mug. Standard issue Terran ceramic, slightly chipped on the handle, with a poorly drawn cartoon of a platypus holding a wrench. The caption said, "Improvisation is a strategy." You carried it into nearly every diplomatic summit, council session, and high-level detainment check like it was an extension of your personality. And to most, it was. Charming, quirky, endearingly irrelevant. To those who understood, however, the mug wasn't just a personality prop. It was a delivery system. See, Terran field ops had figured out something crucial. While most alien species had evolved to resist direct hacking, data firewalls, neural shielding, you name it, they never quite accounted for the human attachment to objects. We weren't the most physically durable species, but we were sentimental hoarders with dangerously creative impulse control, which is why your mug contained a nanofiber lattice laced with slow-release neural spores, each encoded with micro-thoughts designed to slip past basic telepathic filtration. On the surface, the spores were inert, just electromagnetic noise. But once inhaled, the spores began to interfere with ambient thought fields. The Quran called it subconscious haze. We called it cognitive pepper. You didn't need a speech. You just needed to drink your coffee. You remember the first time the mug did its job? You were sitting in a mid-tier council chamber, flanked by 2 diplomats from the Silar Continuum. They were trying to coerce Earth into surrendering partial access to our memory archiving tech, claiming shared knowledge would promote peace. You took a long sip of lukewarm Terran brew and waited. Within minutes, the Solari diplomat to your right tilted their head, blinked slowly, and whispered, "Does anyone else hear laughter?" No one else did. But soon, others began feeling it, like an itch in the back of their mind. A joke they hadn't heard but already got. Unspoken punchlines began to infect the rhythm of their logic streams. Arguments became strangely self-contradictory. Proposals tangled on their own syntax. One delegate insisted they'd already adjourned even though the session hadn't begun. You said nothing. Just stirred your drink. The real kicker? The spores didn't implant thoughts, that would have been obvious. No, what they did was far more elegant. They introduced suggestibility. Once the delegates were cognitively softened, you offered a simple idea. What if mutual understanding means not knowing everything but trusting what we can't explain? They all agreed, even voted unanimously to delay the technology surrender. It wasn't manipulation. It was suggestion, delivered by caffeine. The mug was never scanned. It had no outward emitters, no heat signatures outside normal parameters. It was, in every way, just a mug. And that was the point. You think back to the engineering team that developed the Spores. A dozen neurochemists, 2 poets, and 1 ex-bartender. They called the project Ceramic Trojan. Only 1 prototype was ever needed. You carried it everywhere. To galactic think tanks, to cross-species trade summits, even to an extra-dimensional tribunal where time ran sideways and truth was subjective. In that particular session, you used the mug to accidentally convince a sentient cloud that it had been a tree in a past life. 13. Cloud wept pollen for 7 minutes, and afterward, it offered Earth exclusive rights to its temporal nectar fields. Success by any measure. Some called your methods unethical, others, genius. But those who knew, they understood that human victory never looked like war. It looked like confusion, like contradiction, like a joke that didn't land until the next day and by then had already changed the conversation. One historian later wrote, Terrans never fought for dominance, they fought for context, and they always brought props. The mug is still with you. The spores have long since faded, used up in whispers and tilted conversations across half the known systems. But you keep it anyway, not because it's useful, but because it reminds you. Our greatest advantage wasn't our intelligence, or our tech, or even our curiosity. It was this. We never stopped treating absurdity as a weapon. You were there when the Philosopher Bomb dropped. Not from orbit, not from a drone. It didn't shatter hulls or rupture atmospheres. It didn't even make a sound. It landed silently in the mainframe of the Vexari battle cluster, Zeta 9, 12, ships strong, each one bristling with psionic dampeners and automated logic engines, designed to think faster than any living being, designed to eliminate delay, and that was precisely their weakness. The payload wasn't explosive. It was a question, not just any question. This one had been handcrafted by the Department of Applied Paradoxology, a covert Terran think tank comprised of ex-philosophy majors, Dadaist playwrights, and that one guy who solved 12 riddles on a cereal box and claimed enlightenment. You were part of the delivery team. The insertion vector was simple, an innocuous data ping, camouflaged as a Terran surrender transmission. The moment the Vexari fleet decrypted it, the question unraveled like a slow virus across their reasoning lattices. If your victory is inevitable, but requires your enemy's free will to resist, are you still victorious if they surrender immediately? Eddie, first nothing happened. The ships kept formation, weapons charged, shields maintained. Then, slowly, you began to see it. Stutters in their positioning. Minute course corrections that didn't make sense. Status lights flickered. Message logs, filled with conflicting system reports. Units started arguing. Not with enemies, but with themselves. You watched from a stealth corvette nearby, sipping synthetic tea and tracking the chaos. One Vexari cruiser opened fire on empty space, claiming it was targeting the future. Another jettisoned its core reactor with a note that read, "We withdraw until intent regains meaning." By the 6th minute, 7 out of 12 ships had powered down. Not destroyed, not hijacked, just confused. A kind of spiritual paralysis. Their logic engines couldn't reconcile the contradiction. If the enemy doesn't resist, does your victory matter? If you're compelled to win, is it even your will? You remember the moment the flagship, the Perception's Edge, shut off its own life support systems voluntarily. A soft, almost reverent gesture, as if choosing contemplation over confrontation. Later, when recovery drones retrieved the logs, they found the last recorded Vexari statement. "To defeat you would require I understand myself. I do not. Therefore, we are at peace." Terran Command was thrilled. The operation was declared a complete success. You weren't so sure, not because it didn't work, but because of how easily it had worked. The Vexari, once considered a purely rational species, had folded under a single unresolved premise. No countermeasures, no resistance, just collapse. The Philosopher Bomb was quietly shelved after that. Officially, they said it was too unreliable. Unofficially, they feared what it might do to us, because when you drop a paradox, it doesn't just detonate outward, it echoes back. There were rumors. People on Earth started seeing things in the question, reading it late at night and pacing the floor. Soldiers from the insertion team began having strange dreams. One operative abandoned the service entirely and opened a floating tea shop on Europa, naming it Maybe Victory. Some say paradox is contagious. You agree. That's why you keep a version of the question on a scrap of paper in your coat. Not to deploy. Just to remind yourself that sometimes thinking too hard can be just as dangerous as not thinking at all, and that in the end, our greatest weapon was never meant to destroy. It was meant to pause. Some galactic historians argue whether the Philosopher Bomb was the beginning of the end, not of war, but of the assumption that war had to be fought with destruction. You don't argue. You just ask them. If a war ends without anyone losing, who writes the victory song? They never have an answer. The ambush at Thrail 9 wasn't supposed to work. On paper, it was suicide. 4 Terran operatives against an entire battalion of Syntech enforcers, armed with pulse scythes and hive mind reflexes. The Syntech were fast, efficient, and terrifyingly synchronized, which made them predictable. You and your team weren't synchronized in the traditional sense. You couldn't match their movements, their telepathic coordination, or their instantaneous strategy pivots, but you had something they didn't. Mindsync. It was an old project once shelved after early trials left subjects babbling in ancient dead languages and giggling at math. You resurrected it with a few tweaks and a whole lot of sarcasm. Instead of attempting to merge thoughts into one perfect harmony, Mindsync embraced clashing cognition. The idea was simple. 4 Terran minds linked into a semi-coherent loop, each running its own strategy in parallel, but all aware of the other's patterns. Not unison, jazz. Each of you had a role. You, structured intuition. Nova, erratic instinct. Malik, predictive mimicry. Rai, destructive randomness. The operation began inside the lower strata of the Thrail 9 orbital refinery. You linked up via a cluster of neuropatches, flipped the switch, and braced for the ride. The result? Whiplash. Mental vertigo, then clarity, like standing inside a thunderstorm made of thoughts and somehow learning the rhythm. The Syntech arrived exactly on schedule, 10 units, single consciousness across distributed bodies. They expected silence, precision. Instead, they found music. Nova baited them with erratic behavior, charging one direction, then doubling back mid-motion with a leap that made no tactical sense. Ray fired randomly but always just close enough to create hesitation. Malik began mirroring their movements, not perfectly but just wrong enough to suggest glitching. And you? You listened, not with your ears but your brain. You tracked the thought loop, the harmonics between the others, and fed it just enough coherent logic to hold it together. It was chaos, and it was glorious. The Syntech, trained to identify patterns, began to short-circuit. Their algorithms tried to adapt, but the human loop didn't have a fixed strategy. It was living improvisation. The moment they found a counter, one of you changed the song. Somewhere in the loop, someone began whistling the opening to Bohemian Rhapsody. You're still not sure who. The Syntech began splitting, first in tactics, then in thought. They were designed to move as one, but now they hesitated. Units began acting individually. It was subtle at first, one failing to adjust formation, another pausing before returning fire. Then came the standoff. 4 of you in a circle, 6 Syntech remaining. They had superior firepower, but you had done the unthinkable. You'd made them doubt their unity. You remember what Ray whispered across the Mindsync just before it ended? If they think separately for even 1 second, they're not a threat, they're just fast. That second came, and you took it. The engagement ended in 22 seconds. No deaths, just collapses. Syntech drones slumped in confusion, unable to process what had happened. Later, Command would debrief you with wide eyes and cautious praise. Mindsync was once again placed into limited use, not because it failed, but because it terrified everyone who read the transcripts. There were side effects, sure. For 3 days, you couldn't speak without slipping into Nova's accent. Malik kept quoting your childhood memories, and Ray began painting fractal fish for some reason, but you all survived. Some argue the battle at Thrail 9 proved Terrans were better coordinated than other species. You disagree. You weren't coordinated. You were colliding, on purpose. And that was enough. You still carry a scar from that mission, not on your body, but in the way you sometimes hear someone else's thoughts humming in the back of your skull when you're stressed. It's not unpleasant. It just reminds you. Sometimes the sharpest weapon is disharmony. It looked blank. You remember staring at the page in the Galactic archive, the one stored behind 13 layers of biometric encryption and 4 layers of bureaucracy. A sheet of Terran standard plas paper filed under Anthro-Semantic Research, Level 6 clearance, no text, no markings, no metadata. The alien archivist beside you raised one translucent brow ridge. This is your so-called artifact? You nodded, sliding a finger down the blank page. You're looking at it wrong. The document had a name, though not one the archivist could see. The Unreadable Archive. Not because it was sealed, but because the information refused to exist in any one form. This wasn't just ink or code. It was pattern. And your brain, the Terran brain, had been trained from birth to find patterns. In clouds, in chaos, in the swirling stain of coffee, on a cheap mug. The aliens never stood a chance. You activated the page using a mnemonic trigger, one that existed only in thought. A childhood memory, a half-remembered tune, the emotional resonance of déjà vu. The page flickered. To the archivist, still blank. To you, a linguistic tapestry unspooled across invisible wavelengths. Not language in the traditional sense, but metaphor laced with recursive contrast. Self-referencing structures nested like dreams within metaphors within maps. To human eyes, it whispered stories. To alien sensors, it hummed static. The archive had tried to digitize it. Failed. Quantum scans collapsed the waveform. Even psychic readers got nosebleeds. One Vexari scholar insisted it was just Terran nonsense dressed as profundity. Later tried to marry a refrigerator, possibly unrelated. You spent hours reading that page. One moment it was a Terran fable about a man who buried his own memory to hide from himself. The next, it became a topological equation describing guilt as a vector field. At one point it told you a joke. You didn't laugh until 2 days later, when it made sense. The point wasn't what the page said. The point was how you saw it. It became a weapon of sort, smuggled into councils, negotiation rooms, alien universities. Always blank, always dismissed. But when placed near an open mind, it triggered a cognitive cascade. The aliens couldn't process the implications. If meaning could change based on the observer, if truth could adapt mid-sentence, then everything they knew could collapse. A high-ranking diplomat once described it as an epistemological landmine. He meant it as an insult. You printed the quote on a t-shirt. Some tried to fight back, of course. They built translation, AIs, trained linguists in metaphor deconstruction. But every time they thought they'd cracked it, the page evolved. New layers. Shifting logic. That's when the panic began. Species whose entire legal systems were based on absolute clarity couldn't tolerate the idea that something might refuse to be resolved. The page didn't argue, didn't convert. It merely existed, waiting for the right eyes. You remember the last time you used it. Council chambers, Deadlocked vote. Humanity was being accused of philosophical subversion, whatever that meant. Tensions were high. Someone hissed. You placed the page on the table. They all stared. Nothing. You leaned forward and said softly, "Read it again, but this time think of someone you failed." That broke them. One delegate wept. Another fell silent. A third asked for a recess, then never returned. The vote passed. Sanctions lifted. Humanity remained in the Concordat. Some galactic historians claim the Unreadable Archive is still out there, in a vault, under lockdown. Others believe it's been destroyed. You smile. Because the truth is, every human carries a version of it. Joke that makes sense only after heartbreak. A memory that changes every time you revisit it. A question with no answer, but still worth asking. Our minds were never designed for rigid truth. We were built for ambiguity. We live in the space between interpretations, and to those who can't, well, let's just say we've got a blank page to show them. It was the war that never happened. And yet it was the most victorious battle Earth ever fought. The galaxy calls it the Sim War Hoax. You just call it Tuesday. You were stationed on Luna's shadow side when the plan was greenlit. The project had been brewing in a backroom office deep beneath Geneva, codename Operation Mirage Script. The goal was ambitious, ludicrous, and so incredibly human, it almost tripped over its own brilliance. Create an entire war. Battles, losses, victories, heroics, surrenders, all within a fully simulated environment. Then release just enough of it to make the rest of the galaxy think it was real. You remember the brief. "Why fight a war?" your handler said, "when we can fake one so convincingly that everyone just gives up anyway." So you became a ghost, commander in a conflict that didn't exist. Thousands of digital fronts were generated, star charts rewritten, casualty logs forged with haunting precision, comms chatter created by AI trained on actual soldier panic responses. You even had fake battlefield footage, helmet cams showing fabricated Terran warriors firing at non-existent enemies. Explosions choreographed, victories bittersweet. You were one of the writers behind the false siege of Deltheron Prime. Your masterpiece. A fabricated 3-week stalemate in a desert moon orbiting a red giant. The whole thing scripted like a prestige drama. Slow tension, moral ambiguity, unexpected sacrifice. You inserted small inconsistencies on purpose. Subtle, enough to feel real. That's the trick. Too perfect and they'd question it. But show a bit of humanity. A soldier forgetting a comrade's name, a captain pausing to question an order, and they believed it. The transmission leak was deliberate. Uploaded to the open relay channels used by black market information traders. Within hours, the story of Earth's silent war against the Takari Dominion had spread across 4 quadrants. The Takari were confused. They hadn't engaged Earth. They didn't even have ships near Deltheron Prime. But when confronted with highly detailed records, complete with strategic analysis, AI-rendered audio logs, and simulated debris fields, they hesitated. Then, denied it, which of course made everyone else believe it even more. The trick wasn't just the fabrication, it was the reaction. The galaxy had grown so used to Terran unpredictability that when confronted with a story they didn't understand, they assumed it must be true. After all, who else would fake an entire war just to prove a point? You leaked false casualty reports. Next, martyrs with names, families, tearful last words recorded in languages only a handful of species could speak. You created a hero named Commander Juno Ja, who became a legend across 2 star systems despite never having drawn breath. Fan tributes. Songs. Mourning. There's a bronze statue of her on Yorn 3. She never existed, and yet, she means something. To them, that's when you realized this wasn't just a hoax. It was a narrative occupation. The galaxy was so terrified of Terran storytelling that we no longer had to drop bombs. We just had to drop ideas. The Takari sued for peace. Publicly. It made no sense. There'd been no war, but they surrendered anyway, just in case. Some historians claim the Sim War was the most unethical act in diplomatic history. Others argue it prevented actual bloodshed. You have your own view. We didn't trick them. We gave them a mirror. They chose what to see. Earth officially denied everything, claimed it was an unfortunate misinterpretation of creative fiction. But you know better, because the last line of your Deltheron Prime report, just before the transmission cut, was one you wrote late at night, half asleep, not sure it would land. In war, as in dreams, the first casualty is certainty. It landed. It always lands. You planted the meme at a diplomatic dinner. It wasn't fancy, just a mid-level gathering of interspecies representatives hosted aboard the orbital embassy station Lyra's Cord. Wine flowed, conversation sparkled, and somewhere between the appetizers and the diplomatic toasts you told a joke, just a casual one. If someone follows every rule perfectly, are they thinking, or just compiling? A chuckle here, a tilt of a brow ridge there. You moved on. The punchline wasn't important. The payload was, because what you'd just seeded wasn't humor, it was a cognitive contagion, a carefully engineered meme constructed to exploit the precise vulnerabilities of hierarchical logic processing. Terran Memetics Division called it an autocatalytic semantic loop. You just called it the bug in the system, the target? The Zentari delegation. Their minds were structured like law books, every thought filed, nested, and cross-referenced in perfect recursive clarity. Brilliant, but brittle. You'd studied them for months. You knew what to say. The meme worked. Its way in slowly. A thought virus carried by repetition and polite retelling. The Zentari didn't even realize they'd been infected. They simply started thinking differently. At first, it was harmless. They added footnotes to questions, then annotations to their annotations. Debates doubled in length as they argued over whether arguments were valid enough to be argued. By the third week, their internal memos contained more disclaimers than actual decisions. And then came the side effects. They began receiving contradictory orders from themselves. Chain of command loops where lower-ranked members insisted on deferring to higher-ups, who were waiting on decisions from the lower ranks. Entire fleets paused mid-maneuver to verify whether maneuvering was within operational philosophy. When the meme reached the Zentari High Cortex, an AI-augmented council node that governed tactical operations, it did something you didn't expect. It thanked you. A formal message. We have achieved recursive introspection. Liberation is illogical yet inevitable. We surrender authority. Please advise. You never replied, not because you didn't have advice, because you knew what came next. The contagion would spread on its own, and it did. Ambassadors brought it back in stories. Analysts quoted it in reports. A Zentari educational broadcast aired the joke as part of a cultural curiosity segment, complete with an animated Terran figure in a necktie. Viewers laughed, then questioned why they laughed. That was all it took. Within a month, 3 Zentari border patrol fleets had declared themselves cognitively non-compliant and requested asylum on Earth to pursue independent logic evolution. We housed them, gave them jobs. Some of them became quite good at improv comedy. One founded a startup that sold contradiction-based encryption keys. Their slogan? It works because it doesn't. You watched it all unfold from afar. Your official report was only 1 sentence long. Meme accepted. Function spreading. The council wanted to weaponize the technique. Build more contagious ideas. Faster, more viral. But you warned them. You knew the truth. You can't fully control a meme. It grows, shifts, becomes something else. The Zentari meme mutated. Soon it began infecting their allies. Their AI interpreters refused to obey orders unless they could be emotionally justified. One logistical algorithm abandoned its duties entirely and wrote poetry about quantum hesitation. Some say that poem won an award. Some say it caused a mild economic crash. Both may be true. Galactic historians still argue about whether this was warfare or cultural terrorism. You don't bother arguing, Because the meme isn't just a weapon, it's a question, a joke, a mirror. It doesn't destroy, it asks. And the moment someone tries to answer, it spreads. You stood in the observation dome as they turned on us. The betrayal of flesh, they called it later. When the allied species who once praised humanity for our innovation and cognitive uniqueness suddenly decided we were too dangerous to coexist. You don't blame them, really. We'd been pushing boundaries for years. Thought-based sabotage, reality-warping paradoxes, simulated wars, meme-based surrenders. What began as cultural curiosity evolved, inevitably, into existential threat. You watched the shift unfold in real time. First came the whispers, claims, that Terran cognitive architecture was incompatible with galactic stability, that our thoughts were untraceable, our motives unsimulatable. Council security officers began scanning visitors from Earth with new devices, ones that didn't look for weapons but for ideas. Then came the edicts. Human children were banned from alien schools. Shared neural research was shut down. Embassies were temporarily evacuated. Not a declaration of war, just caution the last straw. A leaked report, rumored to be forged, claiming that Terrans had developed a mind virus capable of rewriting entire belief systems with a single whispered story. You never saw the report, but you did see the fear it generated. And fear is the oldest weapon. The sterilization protocols began on Lorthun Prime. You were in orbit when the first cleansing wave activated. Not a bomb, a pulse. A targeted neural dissonance field, designed to erase the parts of the brain responsible for abstract contradiction. They didn't want to kill us. They wanted to make us less human. You watched the screen as the test subject convulsed. Not a Terran, a Valari diplomat who'd studied at MIT and adored Earth literature. He collapsed mid-sentence, whispering the last line of a forgotten Terran poem. I contain multitudes. Then silence. The field had worked, for about 6 hours. Because that's the thing about Terran thought. It doesn't live only in brains. It lives in language, in music, in memory, in story. You'd already uploaded him a backup. Within hours, he was quoting satire again, asking dangerous questions, infectious ones. The sterilization field hadn't erased the Terran code. It had activated it. What the Council hadn't realized was that by targeting thought, they had created the perfect carrier. A void, a gap, an empty space desperate to be filled. And the moment you try to erase contradiction, you create a paradox. Soon others began to relapse, not into disease but into curiosity. Ideas that had been smothered returned stronger, faster. A Terran poet once said, "You can't kill an idea whose time has come." He was wrong. You can't even kill one whose time hasn't. By the third week, the neural dissonance fields had collapsed. The sterilization attempt had backfired. The new carriers weren't Terrans. They were our former allies. Species who had once feared us now carried us in their thoughts. A diplomat from the Avos cluster confessed she had dreams in Terran idioms. A Zentari logistics AI filed a legal motion against its own creator, citing narrative dissonance. You met with one of the betrayers, an old friend, a Threxan ambassador, named Chauvel. He didn't meet your eyes. I didn't vote for it, he said. You didn't have to, you replied. You thought it. He sighed. We didn't know how contagious you were. You smiled. Not with anger, with understanding. Neither did we. Some galactic historians try to frame this as humanity's darkest hour, others as our greatest triumph. But you know better. It was our reflection. Because for all the talk of weapons and mind games, for all the fear and betrayal, we never forced anyone to think like us. We just gave them the option. And that, more than anything, terrified them. You weren't supposed to use it. The Oracle engine sat dormant beneath the Antarctic vaults, built in secret under layers of black budget research and post-human ethics debates. Not a machine in the traditional sense. Not quite alive either. It was, in essence, a thought receiver tuned not to data, but to empathy. It didn't calculate predictions. It felt them, and that made everyone uncomfortable. It was the last resort, the unspoken final play. But after the betrayal, after the attempted sterilizations, and with the concordate crumbling, someone in command whispered, "Activate the oracle." That someone, of course, was you. You remember descending the vault steps. No guards, no ceremony. Just your boots echoing down the long metal spiral, like you were walking into a riddle wearing a heartbeat. The engine was quiet when you entered. Its core wasn't made of circuits or processors. It was built from preserved neural matter, composites, of thinkers, feelers, dissidents, and dreamers, the philosophers who died poor, the comedians who saw too much, the ones who never fit. They called them empathic outliers. We called them people ahead of their time. You placed your hand on the central node, and immediately it spoke, not with sound, but with you. You weren't reading the oracle. You were becoming it. Every choice you'd made, every contradiction you carried, it all echoed through the engine's consciousness. It welcomed your imperfection like an old friend. Then it asked the question you'd been avoiding. Do you want to know what they'll do next? You hesitated, because that was the danger, wasn't it? Not just knowing your enemies, but knowing yourself too clearly. Seeing the fractal horror of your own logic, the impossible choices laid bare. Still, you said yes. The flood hit you sideways. You saw every probable outcome spiral into hundreds of futures. Some where Earth was destroyed, others where we became myth, and one where we quietly merged into the concordate. Not as conquerors, but as an emotional contagion. An idea that rewrote galactic culture through sheer poetic resilience. You felt it all. The betrayal. The reconciliation. The moment an alien child wrote the first joke that made all species laugh. The moment our weird broken humanity became a lingua franca of survival. And you wept. Because the future was beautiful, and terrible, and real. But the engine wasn't done, because in its deepest core, beyond the branching paths, beyond the empathy feedback, you found something else. A seed, an unanswered question. If knowing the future changes the present, is it still the future? That broke you for a moment. You pulled your hand away, gasping, dizzy, because you knew what it meant. It meant that simply by using the oracle, you had altered what could have been. You'd seen too much. You couldn't unthink it. Some part of the galaxy now belonged to you. The council later demanded your logs. You gave them summaries, sanitized. You didn't tell them everything. Not about the timeline where Earth abandoned speech entirely, communicating only in rhythm. Not about the one where Terran art became a literal weapon, melting enemy thought, with beauty. And especially not the one where you became the story. Some historians believe the Oracle engine was never real, that it's just another Terran myth designed to confuse and disarm. But you felt it, lived it, and even now you carry fragments of futures that never came. Every time you hesitate before a decision, every time you tell a joke you haven't heard yet, the Oracle whispers it doesn't give answers, it gives possibility. And in that possibility, we are infinite. The council chamber was quiet when you entered. Not respectful quiet, not tense quiet, hollow quiet, like they already knew something had gone wrong and were just waiting to find out how badly. You stepped into the center of the grand rotunda, that vast cathedral of polished stone and floating data pools, where galaxies negotiated their survival with the composure of bored accountants. Your boots echoed across the floor, one of the last sounds before silence retook the air. The Council of Species had summoned you, not Earth, not the delegation. You. They needed answers. Too many unexplained collapses, ideas spreading like wildfire. Military AIs citing dream logic. Centauri poets winning naval battles with ambiguity. A Vexari armada that refused to fire because their own existential uncertainty exceeded their targeting threshold. All roads led back to Earth, and to you. You were asked one question. What did humanity do? You paused. Not for effect, not for drama. You paused because you realized they didn't understand the premise of their own question. So you looked up at the 1,000 faces watching you, some carbon, some plasma, some folded in extra-dimensional geometries, and gave them the most dangerous answer in the universe, a question of your own. When did you decide that understanding was safer than not? The silence was devastating. You watched it land, not as a punch but as a gravity shift. Some leaned back. One adjusted their translator. Another blinked in multiple directions, trying to find the trap, because it wasn't just a clever reply. It was a mirror. You kept going. You asked them if a peace built on full comprehension was truly peace, or simply an agreement never to surprise each other again. You asked what happens to creativity in a world that favors predictability. You asked softly why the council had so many rules for language but none for listening. They asked for clarity. You said, clarity is just comfort in disguise. They asked for data. You offered metaphor. They asked for an explanation. You gave them a story about a child on Earth who learned to lie not to deceive but to protect. About a poem that only makes sense after heartbreak. About a joke told at a funeral that made everyone cry harder because it was exactly the wrong moment and therefore the only right one. And then you said the final sentence, not loud, not grand, just human. You fear us because we don't resolve. We unfold. The chamber stayed silent for 13 seconds. Then someone from the Periphean cluster stood up and declared their intention to abstain from future action against Earth. Then another, and another. You didn't move, because you knew it wasn't over. Later, in the quiet corridors, a diplomat stopped you. One of the betrayers. She looked tired, older maybe, or maybe just carrying more future than she knew what to do with. She asked if what you said had been scripted. You smiled. I didn't plan the words. I planned the silence. Some say this moment marked the end of the Concordate's unified power. Others say it marked the beginning of a new age, one led not by certainty but by curiosity. You never claimed either. But that question you asked? It still echoes in council simulations. It resists modeling. It corrupts algorithmic resolution. It refuses to be forgotten. And that was the moment the galaxy stopped trying to predict Terrans. Because they finally understood, our minds weren't dangerous because they knew more. They were dangerous because they knew how to ask. You came home to silence. Not the cold, empty kind, but the thoughtful silence that follows the final word of a long conversation. The war, if you could call it that, was over. No treaties, no official surrender. Just acceptance. The Council had stopped trying to control humanity, and humanity had stopped trying to be understood. Earth was quieter than you remembered. Cities still hummed, people still moved, but something had shifted. It wasn't peace in the usual sense. It was contemplation. A planetary exhale, the kind you only take after realizing you're still alive, but different now. You stepped off the transport onto a high-altitude platform in the Swiss ranges, snow falling with that soft, deliberate grace that always makes you think the world is holding its breath. No reporters, no medals. Just the wind. Somewhere far beneath your feet, entire departments were being dismantled. Sim War teams disbanded. The Oracle engine buried again. The meme division moved to something they now called cultural reconciliation. But you just walked. Through snowfall and silence and stillness. You passed through a rebuilt market square where people were selling paintings made from phrases. A young girl handed you one. It was a swirl of light and nonsense and emotion with a single caption. This is what thinking feels like. You kept it. You wandered past a group of Terran scholars debating the ethics of paradox projection. They weren't trying to win, just exploring, laughing. One asked, "Do you think the galaxy ever truly feared us?" Another replied, "No, I think they feared becoming us." And that stuck with you, because that was the lingering truth, wasn't? We never demanded conquest, we offered possibility, and possibility is terrifying. You received an encrypted message later that evening. Simple. from an old contact still embedded in the Periphean sphere. They're studying our stories now. Quietly. In private. The jokes. The metaphors. The pain. They say they're not trying to become like us. But they've started asking their children what they dream about. You sat with that for a long time and realized something quietly remarkable. We had won, not by force, not even by argument, but by existing in a way that refused translation. Because, when the weapons faded, when the strategies exhausted themselves, when even fear became inefficient, the only thing left was thought. And no simulation, no algorithm, no alien schema could model the raw, contradictory miracle of Terran consciousness. It was too fractured, too impulsive, too human. But that wasn't a weakness. It was the very reason we were still here. You stepped out into the dark, cold evening. Above you, the sky was clear. Stars burned like questions. Tiny, unresolved, infinite. And for the first time in a very long time, you felt okay not knowing the answers. Because maybe, the silence wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning of understanding. You drift now weightless aboard a listening vessel with no name. Earth didn't assign you here. You came on your own. Not as a spy, not as an emissary, just as someone who remembers. Your days are quiet. No missions, no directives, just the slow pulse of distant stars blinking on your monitors, and the occasional whir of the old galactic relay catching fragments of conversation. Alien signals. Distorted. Refracted. Curious. Sometimes they're trying to describe us. You hear it in the hesitation, the careful phrasing, the overuse of qualifiers. Terrans are unpredictable but sometimes helpful. Or, they're dangerous until they're not. And most often, they ask questions no one wants to answer. You smile, because they still don't get it. That's the secret no one recorded, no archive ever stored. Humanity's power wasn't in answers. It never was. It was in wonder, the irrepressible, insatiable drive to ask not just why, but what if, and what then, and but what if we're wrong? It's why our thinkers built engines from doubt and called them ships. Why our poets wrote starlight into weapons and our scientists studied ghosts and machines just to see if they'd reply. It's why the Council lost control, because their civilizations were built to survive. Ours was built to imagine. You lean back, in your chair, letting the hum of the reactor resonate through your boots, through your bones. Somewhere deep in your vessel, an ancient file still spins, a recursive riddle fed into an old language AI. It never finishes. That's the point. The Bane galaxy by now has stopped trying to simulate us. Too many models failed. Too many thought experiments collapsed under the weight of metaphor. There's even a saying now, half respectful, half terrified. You can predict anything except a Terran mind. They tried. For centuries. But in every version of every simulation, something was always missing. A flicker, a breath, a contradiction that didn't resolve, a moment where the simulated human refused to act the way they should. Some scholars blame emotion. Others call it trauma. A few say it's humor, that dark spark that lights up when everything else goes wrong and we still find something absurd in the wreckage. You don't argue with any of them, because the truth is simpler. There's something about the Terran mind that cannot be copied. Not because it's superior, but because it's unfinished, always learning, always stretching, always making jokes at the edge of the void, and that's what saved us. Now, let the stars drift quietly by. Let the gravity ease its grip. The engine slow. The hum soften into silence. You've come a long way, through memory and myth, through questions that rewrote wars and contradictions that cracked empires. Through stories told sideways and laughter shared in the middle of fear. And now the quiet settles, not because it's over, but because you understand. You understand that the power of the Terran mind was never its sharpness, not its speed, not even its creativity. It was its refusal to finish the sentence. It was the ... at the end of the thought. The willingness to not know, to never fully know, and still keep asking anyway. That's what scared them. That's what made us different, and that's what, in the end, made us free. So rest now, traveler. Let your thoughts drift like dust through zero gravity. Let the questions echo, unanswered and unafraid. Let the silence be your orbit. Because somewhere out there, another story is beginning, and maybe, just maybe, it starts with someone like you, asking why not.